everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Crime and Fiction series. I'm Sibeli Bustamante, director of NASP, and with me is Thomas Sprengers, a psychologist and criminologist. Today we'll talk about crime fiction history, and we'll limit ourselves due to time constraints mostly to the Western and English literature before the Second World War. We'll refer to Brazil whenever possible, and in the third episode we're going to talk about what happens after the Second World War. So Thomas, where would you like to begin?
Narratives of crime are as old as the story of Sisyphus in Greek mythology. Different cultures talked about crime in different ways, but the general tone was mostly moralizing. You can, for example, look in the Arabic world. You had the Tales of 1001 Nights. That already contains the first whodunit. But even in the Ming Dynasty, for example, you had court case fiction that talked about judges that would solve a court case and the reader would follow that process. But the real beginning of what I would like to talk about as crime fiction is the moment when the story engages the reader with a difficult puzzle that a detective or an amateur tries to solve. And the reader follows that process, and at the end it's resolved.
Before we start with the engaging part, can you give us an example of this narrative of crime narratives used as moralization?
I can give some really interesting examples. I would like to talk about the Middle Ages and the early modernity. In those periods, people would use folklore, fables and ballads to talk about crime. And these were generally passed on orally and had a strong moralizing character. The form of ballads made it easy for people to remember because they were rhyming, and that helped the oral communication. In the 15th century, these were the first forms of written material about crimes. Generally, these ballads were in the first person, and there was a heavy emphasis on the remorsefulness. In addition to having the ballads, they generally also had an indication of the tune to which the ballad should be sung. I selected an execution ballad for everybody to hear. This one is written for the execution of Judith Brown. She was a maidservant condemned in 1684 for conspiring with her master to poisoning her mistress. So let's listen to that now.
Too late I do lament, my very heart doth bleed, that ever I did give content to that most wicked deed. In this devouring flame my life must now expire. Alas, my sins I needs must blame, I end my days in fire. To you that come to see a woeful sinner's fall, oh, let those cruel flames now be a warning to you all.
The Brazilian cordéis are similar to this. These were originally 11th century minstrel stories that were later brought to Brazil. They would sometimes involve criminal histories, and in general they were not really considered high art. Now, if we move on to the 17th century, a new phenomenon is the execution sermon. It's when Puritan ministers would give a sermon before or during the execution. And this was to remind the people that they were not that different from the perpetrator, and that the only thing stopping them from being the same is the grace of God. So again, you can see heavily moralizing.
And when does moralization give way to the engaging writing in crime?
So journalistic writing about crime starts more or less during the Industrial Revolution. Due to urbanization, people started moving to cities, and in the cities they were closer on top of each other. People felt a little bit lost. Crime started to rise in that era, and so different cities had to start having police forces and detective units. In London, for example, this happened in 1829. With this, policing and the job of being a detective really became a profession. And this is the start of police work being proceduralized. At this time of urbanization and industrialization, the literacy levels also started to rise. And people had a little bit more money, so they could spend money on entertainment. And reading became valid entertainment. At the same time, there was the invention of the steam printing, and this made it easier to mass produce literature. And this resulted in several different products for the new readers. So This was the beginning of the real popularity of newspapers for the common man. Now, in the beginning, they were incredibly sensationalistic and not very high on accuracy and detail. So in the 19th century, there are basically three reasons why crime fiction gains in popularity. Firstly, it's, as I said, people start to see it as entertainment. They live in those cities where crime happens, and it's an interesting topic for them. A second aspect is what I would call escapism. People live in dirty, crowded city of London, for example, and crime fiction gives them an opportunity to escape to a different world. A world wherein good and evil are very obviously identified. They sort of battle it out, and eventually the good wins in the end. Also important, I think, is the historical context. We're talking about the Victorian era. So this follows the era of Enlightenment and Romanticism. So this is a very, very important era for the church losing a little bit of grip on society and reason gaining grip. It's a period in which very important inventions are made, like the camera and telephone. Not unimportant in this era is also the new scientific publications, as for example, very important Origin of Species by Darwin. So you can quite obviously see how the moralizing aspect in the literature changes. So it goes from being very moralizing lessons to sort of voluntary moralizing calibration. With that I mean people read the book and they're left to their own decisions, how they want to feel about the good and evil in the book.
Can you give us an example of this popularization in crime fiction?
The most obvious example of this popularization, I think, is a result of the new steam printing press, the ability to spread the literature more rapidly through the railways, and what emerges in the UK, for example, the penny dreadfuls. These were short stories, generally in 8 or 16 parts, that you could buy for 1 penny. They would cover a lot of different topics, often supernatural or historical stories in a new version, but also crime stories. In America you had the dime novel as a counterpart of this, so they would cost 10 cents or a dime. One of the most popular dime novels was the New York Detective Library. In Brazil, the phenomenon for cheap, easy-to-read fiction started a little bit later, but followed the same trend. Between 1850 and 1950, there was a trend that focused on mystery stories, urban legends, things like that. Many times they were first published in newspaper, but later they could be found in book form. The literary tradition of police and detective writing in Brazil was a little bit different as well. It was less focused on the police, more on the crimes, the perpetrators and their punishments. You could maybe think that this was a result of the function of the police in Brazil in the beginning, as much more being a force to protect the rich and the powerful and less working for the common man. The real history of crime fiction starts in 1841 with The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe.
And what makes the Murders of Rue Morgue so different than the others?
Well, crime writing did exist before that, but what is really new is that Poe introduces the character of Dupin as the first detective, a word that didn't even exist at that time. He's actually based on a real-life ex-criminal and later detective Eugène Vidocq. And the reader is confronted with a mystery, and Dupin, the detective, takes you through the different steps to get to the solution. The story is told by a companion of Dupin, something that we will see later in Sherlock Holmes and Watson. What is most special about him is it's the first time that the detective shows his brilliance and his logic, what Poe would call ratiocination. And you can see the thought process in action. And as a reader, you are invited to follow the process and maybe even solve the case before Dupin actually does it. The reader gets all the information necessary to solve it.
I take it that this has influenced the following crime stories, right?
Yeah, there's some very important characteristics that Poe first introduces. So, as I said, we have the brilliant detective, often not a professional detective. We have the aspect that the police is not really cooperating or they're not smart enough to solve the case themselves. Another aspect is that the reader is challenged to solve the story before the actual detective does. And then when it comes to the solution of the mystery, at the end of the story, the brilliant detective announces that he has found the solution, and then he explains his thinking. It's the first locked room mystery. The first real detective novel follows soon after in 1868. It's called The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. This again features a brilliant detective, Sergeant Cuff, who is also again based on a real-life detective, one of the first detectives of Scotland Yard.
And why was that so significant?
Well, it's important not because it's the first novel, but also because it introduces a lot of new characteristics of detective novels. It has a very colorful cast of suspects. It shows a gentleman detective, and usually the locations are very picturesque. They make use of red herrings, which are distracting clues, and it introduces the idea of an inside job and the idea of a least likely subject as the perpetrator.
You mentioned Sherlock Holmes, so when does it come into the picture?
That's actually relatively quite soon after. In 1887, Arthur Conan Doyle publishes A Study in Scarlet, and we are introduced to the brilliant detective Sherlock Holmes and his sidekick Watson. Not only is he one of the most famous detectives, he is also one of the most famous characters in fiction ever. The character of Sherlock Holmes was in part based on Auguste Dupin from Edgar Allan Poe, but also on a real-life doctor, Dr. Joseph Bell, whom Arthur Conan Doyle met, and he based the use of logic and intelligence and wit on this man. And it's this wit and logic that makes Sherlock Holmes the archetypical super detective. And Arthur Conan Doyle continued to publish Sherlock Holmes novels till 1927.
And what was the next big step on crime fiction?
We have to make a little jump, but the next important era is the golden age of crime fiction. This is from 1920 to 1939. In this period there were several authors and several genres, but the majority were British and a lot of them were female. The basic formula of that time was the whodunit. A murder occurs, the police are either unwilling or incapable to solve the crime, so an outsider has to step in to solve the puzzle. There are generally a lot of different suspects, but they are one by one eliminated until the only murderer is left. Some of the most famous authors of that time are referred to as the four queens of crime. So we have Agatha Christie, Ngaio Marsh, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Marjorie Allingham.
Well, it's nice to see so many female writers.
Well, even nowadays, women are very well represented in crime fiction literature. The four queens of crime fiction produced many novels. Most famous is probably Agatha Christie. She produced 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections. And Agatha Christie is listed as the #1 best-selling author of all time. She sold more than 2 billion books. In Brazil, the popularity of the detective genre in the beginning had much to do with translated works from abroad, of which Agatha Christie was also an important example, and this was done through the Livraria Globo, and these were published as the Coleção Amarela in the 1930s. Brazilian authors of the genre found their way to newspapers and magazines, but often they would emulate the style of their British and American counterparts, and they would even use English-sounding pseudonyms. The first Brazilian detective novel was O Mistério from 1920, and this was a collaboration from 4 Brazilian writers. What a lot of the detectives of the Golden Age have in common is that they're not very believable as detectives. So when you think of Christie's Poirot or Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey, they are very gentlemanlike and even snobby. Another development that you see is that amateur detectives enter into the picture. So they can be writers, like in Murder, She Wrote, or priests, like Father Brown in Chesterton's novels. The activities of these characters as detectives are generally incidental, but they bring a whimsical, quirky element to the stories. They still solve the puzzle in a logical way, but it's just to illustrate that there are a lot of variations on the classical detective theme.
What other variations of subgenres you can talk about?
One example is the hard-boiled detective. This is the American counterpart to the British gentleman-like detectives. What American writers try to do is they would make the character much more believable and their surroundings much more believable. They live on the mean streets of a city. These stories include detectives that are dealing with corrupt cops, organized crime. Hardboiled crime novels create a world where it's everybody for themselves. And while the hardboiled detective genre started in the 1920s, it really took off in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. A good example is Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. This introduces us to the detective Philip Marlowe in the movie portrayed by Humphrey Bogart. He also played the character of Sam Spade in Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon, another classic of the genre. A third author I would like to mention is James M. Cain. He wrote The Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity. His stories are a little bit different because they are more violent, they have more sexuality in it, and they are very fast-paced. Another variation on the classic detective is the locked room mystery. In this, the crime scene is an isolated space. It seems impossible for the perpetrator to have committed the crime and avoided detection or escaped. The reader gets all the information that the detective gets, although a lot of this information can be confusing or distracting. And the reader is encouraged to solve the problem before the detective does. The locked room mystery can take the form of, for example, a moving train, as in Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, as in John Dixon Carr's Hollow Man, or a chalet in New England surrounded by snow, as in Hake Talbot's Rim of the Pit. Locked room mysteries are a little bit more how-done-it than who-done-it, but the elements are generally the same.
I remember I loved the detective stories when I was a child. So how did it start? Did it start at that same time?
Yeah, in the beginning of the 20th century, literature for children became very popular. And one of the most popular genres in this was the crime detective. One of the main sources of these books was the Stratemeyer Syndicate. They produced the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew series. Even to this day, they sell more than 1 million copies per year, and they have been translated, both series, into more than 25 different languages. Series are written by different ghostwriters under pseudonyms, but they have incredible popularity even to this day.
So folks, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow us, and see you next time on the third episode, when you're going to talk about the history of crime fiction from the Second World War onwards. See you. Thank you. Bye.